The Nexus station hung in the void like a crystalline spiderweb, its gossamer threads of reinforced transparent aluminum catching starlight from 3 different suns. It was, according to the latest Galactic tourism brochures, a marvel of interspecies cooperation and architectural achievement. What the brochures failed to mention was that it had been built primarily because nobody could agree on whose homeworld should host important diplomatic functions. And after the infamous incident at Kepler 442b, where the hegemony delegation had accidentally declared war on their hosts' dinner arrangements, neutral territory had become something of a necessity. Today, the station's central amphitheater played host to what many considered the most crucial peace summit in recent galactic history. The Outer Rim conflict had been raging for 18 standard months, consuming resources, trade routes, and unfortunately, several billion sentient beings across 14 star systems. It was the sort of grinding, multifaceted war that made military strategists weep into their stimulants and diplomats contemplate career changes into something less stressful, like bomb disposal or volcano surfing. The amphitheater itself was a study in calculated neutrality. The architects had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure no species could claim visual superiority, resulting in a space that managed to be simultaneously magnificent and utterly devoid of character. The seating arrangements alone had required a 6-month subcommittee to determine, with complex algorithms calculating sight lines, atmospheric preferences, and the delicate matter of which species considered which other species' scent glands offensive. Ambassador Kai Okafor of the Terran Diplomatic Corps surveyed this monument to bureaucratic compromise with the practiced eye of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating similar exercises in organized chaos. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with silver-streaked hair and the sort of calm demeanor that suggested she had either achieved inner peace or had simply seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore, she represented humanity's interests with a competence that had become something of a legend in certain diplomatic circles. What was particularly noteworthy about the human delegation, a fact that had been the subject of considerable speculation in the galactic press, was its complete lack of military personnel. While every other major power had arrived with their war primes, battle chancellors, fleet marshals, and various other impressively titled individuals whose primary qualification was their expertise in organized violence, Earth had sent exactly 7 diplomats, 3 cultural attachés, and 1 person whose job title was mysteriously listed as Special Advisor for Contextual Matters. This absence had become something of a running joke among the more militaristic species. The hegemony, whose entire governmental structure was built around the principle that any problem could be solved by applying sufficient quantities of plasma fire, found it particularly amusing. Their delegation had arrived with a full military escort, including War Prime Zethak, a 7-foot-tall walking advertisement for the effectiveness of genetic enhancement and combat stimulants. "Look at them," Zethak had remarked to his aide, gesturing toward the human section with one of his 4 arms. "Sitting there like they're attending a tea party, instead of negotiating the fate of 14 star systems. No wonder they lost their colonies in the Rim." What Zethak and his colleagues failed to understand, though they would shortly and in a manner that would leave several of them requiring mild sedation, was that the absence of human military personnel at peace negotiations was not a sign of weakness, naivety, or even philosophical commitment to non-violence. It was instead a deliberate policy decision made after careful consideration of human military doctrine and its potential effects on diplomatic discourse. The coalition delegation, led by Chancellor Vexer, had taken a more diplomatic approach to mocking human military absence, but their amusement was no less evident. The coalition prided itself on sophisticated warfare. They had elevated orbital bombardment to an art form, and their battle fleets moved with the precision of synchronized swimmers. If synchronized swimmers were equipped with antimatter warheads and a casual disregard for the laws of physics, the humans, Vexar had noted in her pre-summit briefing, appear to operate under the charming delusion that conflicts can be resolved through reason, discourse, and mutual understanding. It's quite endearing, really, like watching children play at being adults. The irony was thick enough to require industrial-grade cutting equipment, But none of the assembled delegates seemed particularly inclined towards self-reflection. They were here to end a war, after all, and wars were serious business, requiring serious people with serious weapons and seriously impressive military credentials. The morning session had proceeded with the sort of ritualized posturing that characterized the opening phases of most diplomatic gatherings. Each delegation had presented their opening positions with varying degrees of subtlety, ranging from the coalition's elegantly crafted proposals that managed to sound reasonable while demanding complete capitulation from their enemies, to the hegemony's more direct approach, which could be summarized as "surrender now or we'll demonstrate why our military budget exceeds the gross domestic product of most star systems." The humans had listened with polite attention, occasionally taking notes, and had responded with the sort of measured, thoughtful proposals that suggested they had actually read the preliminary reports and understood the underlying issues. This, naturally, was viewed with deep suspicion by everyone else present. "They're planning something," muttered Subcommander Threx of the Hegemony Delegation. "No one is that reasonable, without an ulterior motive." By the afternoon session, patience was beginning to wear thin. The Outer Rim conflict was a complex beast, with tentacles reaching into trade disputes, territorial claims, resource rights, and ancient grudges that predated faster-than-light travel. Each attempt to address one aspect of the conflict seemed to create three new problems, and every proposed solution was met with objections that ranged from the perfectly reasonable to the utterly baroque. The hegemony wanted military guarantees, the coalition demanded economic concessions. The Federated Worlds insisted on cultural autonomy clauses. The trade union required shipping lane protections. The independent systems wanted assurances that they wouldn't be invaded next week. Meanwhile, the humans sat quietly, occasionally offering suggestions that were uniformly reasonable, completely practical, and entirely ignored. "Perhaps," Ambassador Okafor suggested during a particularly heated exchange about mining rights in the Kepler system, "we might consider a graduated implementation schedule that addresses the underlying resource allocation issues while maintaining face for all parties involved." The suggestion was met with the sort of polite silence typically reserved for someone who had just proposed resolving galactic warfare through aggressive flower arranging. Warprime Zethak had reached the limits of his patience, which, given his species' biological modifications, was considerably higher than baseline, but still apparently insufficient for this particular exercise in diplomatic frustration. "This is pointless," he declared, rising to his impressive full height and managing to loom even while seated. "We've been talking in circles for 6 hours. The humans offer pretty words and useless compromises while systems burn. Where is your military? Where are your war chiefs? How can we trust the word of a species that sends bureaucrats to end a war?" The amphitheater fell silent. Even the environmental systems seemed to hold their breath, creating a moment of perfect stillness that stretched long enough for several delegates to wonder if they should order lunch or prepare for combat. Ambassador Okafor regarded Warprime Zethak with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the proceedings. When she spoke, her voice carried the sort of quiet authority that suggested she was accustomed to being heard the first time. "You want to know why Earth doesn't send military personnel to peace negotiations?" she asked. "The answer is quite simple, really." She stood, moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in zero-gravity environments, and walked to the central podium. The lighting system automatically adjusted to accommodate her position, casting her in subtle illumination that somehow managed to make everyone else seem slightly less important. "We don't bring our military to peace talks," she continued, "because our military doesn't negotiate. They don't compromise. They don't seek middle ground or look for mutually beneficial solutions. Our military has one function, and they perform it with an efficiency that we've found rather disturbs other species." Chancellor Vexer leaned forward in her seat. "And what function is that, Ambassador?" "Delightful. They win wars." Okafor replied simply, "Completely, permanently, with a thoroughness that tends to make negotiations somewhat irrelevant afterward." The silence that followed was of a different quality than before. This wasn't the respectful pause of diplomatic discourse, but the suddenly alert stillness of predators who had just realized they might not be at the top of the food chain. You see, Okafor continued, her tone remaining conversational, human military doctrine is based on a rather straightforward principle. If you're going to fight a war, fight it once, fight it completely, and make sure you never have to fight it again. We find this approach eliminates the need for follow-up negotiations. War Prime Zethak's forearms shifted restlessly. You're trying to intimidate us with threats. Not at all, Okafor assured him. I'm explaining why we prefer diplomacy. You asked why we don't bring military personnel to peace talks. The answer is that our military personnel aren't trained for peace talks. They're trained for what we call total war doctrine. It's quite effective, but it does tend to leave rather fewer people available for subsequent negotiations. The special advisor for contextual matters chose this moment to clear his throat. Dr. Marcus Webb was a deceptively mild-looking man, whose job description was intentionally vague, and whose presence at diplomatic functions served purposes that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. Perhaps, Dr. Webb suggested quietly, it would be helpful to provide some context. Ambassador Okafor nodded. Dr. Webb was previously attached to our Strategic Analysis Division. He specializes in what we call outcome modeling. Dr. Webb stood, pulling out a small holographic projector that filled the air above the central table with a three-dimensional star map. The outer rim systems glowed in various colors, indicating current territorial control and conflict zones. The outer rim conflict, he began, in the tone of a university lecturer discussing crop rotation schedules, involves 14 star systems, 47 inhabited worlds, approximately 18 billion sentient beings, and military assets valued at roughly 4 trillion galactic standard credits. The hologram shifted, showing fleet positions and battle lines with mathematical precision. Current projections suggest the conflict will continue for another 2 to 3 standard years, consuming additional resources and resulting in approximately 40 to 50 million additional casualties, assuming current tactical doctrines and engagement patterns remain consistent. Chancellor Vexer was beginning to look uncomfortable. Your point, Doctor? My point, Dr. Webb replied pleasantly, is that these projections are based on current participants continuing to fight the war they're currently fighting. If human military doctrine were to be applied to this conflict, the timeline changes rather dramatically. The hologram shifted again, showing new fleet movements and engagement patterns that moved with a cold mathematical precision that somehow seemed more unsettling than the chaotic warfare currently raging in the Rim. Total war doctrine applied to the Outer Rim conflict, Dr. Webb continued, would result in complete resolution within approximately 6 to 8 standard weeks. The mathematical models are quite clear on this point. Subcommander Threx found his voice. That's impossible. The logistical requirements alone are well within Earth's current military capacity, Dr. Webb interrupted gently. We've run the numbers quite thoroughly. The challenge isn't capability, it's the aftermath. What aftermath? War Prime Zethak demanded. Dr. Webb touched the projector controls, and the hologram changed to show the Outer Rim systems in a state of perfect, sterile calm. No fleet movements, no battle indicators, no territorial disputes. The aftermath, Dr. Webb explained, where there's no one left to negotiate with. The amphitheater had grown very quiet indeed. Even the environmental systems seemed to be running more quietly, as if the station's artificial intelligence had decided that loud noises might not be appropriate at the moment. Ambassador Okafor returned to the podium. You see, gentlemen, this is why Earth prefers diplomacy. Not because we're weak or naive or idealistic. We prefer diplomacy because we're very, very good at the alternative, and we've learned that being very good at warfare tends to make you very bad at having neighbors. She gestured to the holographic display. Dr. Webb's models are conservative. They assumed that other species would continue fighting even after it became clear that continued resistance was futile. History suggests this assumption may be overly optimistic regarding survival rates. War Prime Zethak's voice had dropped to something closer to its normal register. You're saying you could end this war in weeks. We're saying, Ambassador Okafor corrected, that we could end all wars in this sector in weeks, permanently. The question is whether that's really what anyone wants. The delegates looked at each other with the sort of careful attention people pay to potential threats they hadn't previously noticed. The dynamic in the room had shifted fundamentally. The humans were no longer the naive peacekeepers being patronized by their more militaristic neighbors. They had become something considerably more unsettling. The adults in the room who were trying very hard to let the children work things out for themselves. Chancellor Vexer was the first to break the silence. "What exactly are you proposing?" "The same thing we've been proposing all day," Ambassador Okafor replied. "A negotiated settlement that addresses the legitimate concerns of all parties while avoiding the sort of escalation that would require us to call home and ask for our military to become involved." The threat was delivered with such perfect diplomatic politeness that it took several seconds for its full implications to register. When they did, the effect was remarkable. Suddenly, the various territorial disputes seemed more negotiable. The trade route disagreements appeared more amenable to compromise. The ancient grudges felt less worth dying for. "Of course," Sub-Commander Threx said hastily, "we've always been committed to finding a peaceful resolution." "Naturally," agreed Chancellor Vexar, "the coalition has always preferred diplomatic solutions." War Prime Zethak, who had spent the morning dismissing human weakness, now found himself studying Ambassador Okafor with the sort of careful attention usually reserved for potentially unstable explosives. "Perhaps we should examine the human proposals more carefully." "Excellent," Ambassador Okafor said brightly, as if the previous 10 minutes of existential threat assessment had never occurred. "Shall we break for refreshments and reconvene in an hour? I find that complex negotiations often benefit from caffeine and pastries." As the delegates filed out of the amphitheater, their conversations had taken on a markedly different tone. The casual dismissal of human proposals had been replaced by careful consideration of implementation timelines. The mockery of human military absence had evolved into cautious inquiry about human military capabilities. The assumption of human weakness had transformed into a healthy respect for human restraint. Dr. Webb packed up his holographic projector with the satisfied air of a professor who had just delivered a particularly effective lecture. "Do you think they understand now?" he asked Ambassador Okafor quietly. "Oh, I think they're beginning to," she replied, watching War Prime Zethak deep in urgent conversation with his military advisors. Nothing motivates diplomatic creativity quite like the realization that the alternative involves explaining to your constituents why you chose extinction over compromise. The afternoon session proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Proposals that had been dismissed as unrealistic in the morning were suddenly discovered to have considerable merit. Territorial disputes that had seemed intractable found creative solutions. Resource allocation disagreements resolved themselves with surprising speed. The Outer Rim peace accords were signed 18 hours later, establishing a framework for resolution that addressed every major point of contention while providing face-saving measures for all parties involved. The signing ceremony was attended by representatives from 14 species, 47 worlds, and was broadcast live across the galaxy as an example of successful diplomatic cooperation. What wasn't mentioned in the press coverage was the remarkably collegial atmosphere that had developed during the final negotiations, or the way that various military advisors had found excuses to avoid questioning the details of proposed enforcement mechanisms, or the speed with which several species had volunteered to host follow-up conferences on their own world. As the Nexus station began to empty, Ambassador Okafor stood at one of the observation decks, watching the various delegations depart for their home systems. The coalition fleet moved with its characteristic precision. The hegemony ships departed in formation that was somehow less aggressive than their arrival. The independent systems vessels left in groups that suggested mutual defense pacts had been hastily negotiated. Dr. Webb joined her at the observation window, carrying 2 cups of what the station optimistically called coffee. "Successful conference," he observed. "Very," she agreed, "though I do feel slightly guilty about terrifying them into reasonableness." "Only slightly?" "Well," Ambassador Okafor smiled, They did spend the entire morning patronizing us about the importance of bringing military advisors to peace negotiations. Sometimes a little education is necessary. And if they hadn't been educated? Ambassador Okafor's smile didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that Dr. Webb's holographic projections might have been less theoretical than they appeared. Then we would have called home and asked General Rivera to pack her bags, though I suspect the next peace conference would have been considerably smaller. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the diplomatic vessels disappear into hyperspace, carrying news of successful negotiations and carefully negotiated peace, back to worlds that would sleep more soundly for not knowing exactly how close they had come to a very different sort of resolution. The Nexus station resumed its usual function as a monument to interspecies cooperation, its crystalline architecture catching starlight from 3 suns and reflecting it back into the void. According to the tourism brochures, it remained a marvel of diplomatic achievement. What the brochures still didn't mention was that it had also become something of a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding exactly why some species prefer talking to fighting, and the wisdom of not confusing restraint with weakness. After all, as Ambassador Okafor often noted in her reports back to Earth, the most successful negotiations are the ones where everyone leaves the table grateful that negotiation was still an option.